Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where the crisp winter air carries not just the scent of pine and rose chestnuts, but also the faintest echo of a mystery. Settle in by the warmth of your hearth, perhaps with a cup of spiced tea, and prepare to journey back to an English village in the early 20th century. Here, amidst the gentle rhythm of daily life and the grand preparations for a special Christmas Eve celebration, something is stirring beneath the surface. Our guide, as ever, will be the unassuming Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp eyes and even sharper mind can discern the darkest truths in the most ordinary of settings. A birthday party on Christmas Eve, a time for joy and togetherness, is about to reveal a tale of hidden desires, long-held resentments, and a secret that threatens to unravel the fabric of a distinguished family. Now, let's start with the first chapter of the Christmas Eve enigma at Blackwood Manor. Chapter 1, The Invitation and the Chill. The air in St. Mary Mead, usually a tapestry of gentle rustles and distant birdsong, was thick with the promise of snow on this December afternoon. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles a rhythmic clack against the quiet, her gaze drifting over the familiar hedgerows. It was a week before Christmas Eve, and the village hummed with a subdued festive anticipation. Then, the postman, Mr. Hemmings, with his robust stomp and cheerful whistle, delivered a particularly elaborate envelope, quite out of the ordinary for Miss Marple's modest cottage. It was an invitation, embossed with the crest of the Finch family, to Mr. Alastair Finch's 70th birthday celebration on Christmas Eve at Blackwood Manor. Mr. Finch was a figure of some local renown, not for his philanthropy or social graces, but for his considerable wealth and his near-hermetic tendencies. Blackwood Manor itself was a grand, sprawling edifice, perched on the edge of the village, shrouded in ancient oaks and a palpable sense of history. Its gates were rarely opened, its inhabitants seldom seen. A birthday party of this magnitude was, in short, unprecedented. Miss Marple smoothed the heavy cardstock with a delicate finger. The script, though elegant, seemed almost too precise, too carefully placed. She noticed a faint, almost imperceptible smudge near the gilded seal, as if it had been hastily pressed. A peculiar detail for a family known for its meticulous adherence to propriety. A shiver, quite distinct from the chill creeping in from the window, traced its way down her spine. It was a sensation she knew well, a premonition of disquietude that rarely proved false. "Birthday party at Blackwood Manor, you say?" Mrs. Bantry's voice boomed from the doorway, her round face alight with curiosity. She had arrived, unannounced as ever, armed with a fresh batch of her celebrated shortbread. "Well, I never! Old Alastair Finch, hosting a bash? He hasn't had more than a vicar's tea party in 40 years, not since all that business with his brother's will, if you recall." Miss Marple offered a polite smile, her needles briefly pausing. "Indeed, dear Dolly. It does seem rather out of character." She remembered the business with his brother's will all too well, a bitter, drawn-out affair decades ago, involving distant cousins and claims of undue influence, leaving the family reputation rather tarnished and Alastair even more withdrawn. It was said his niece, Eleanor, and nephew, Richard, were still rather sore about the limited inheritance they'd received then, though they maintained a facade of decorum. Eleanor, a striking woman with ambitious eyes, often dropped hints of her sacrifices for the family, while Richard, a brooding man prone to financial scrapes, seemed to nurse a quiet resentment. Mrs. Bantry settled into the armchair, nibbling a shortbread. One wonders what prompted such a sudden change of heart. Perhaps he's finally decided to embrace company in his old age, eh? Or perhaps, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, there's something else afoot. People say he's been rather restless lately. Seen his solicitor, Mr. Hemlock, trundling up to the manor almost weekly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Restlessness in a man of Alastair Finch's settled habits was indeed noteworthy. It spoke of unresolved matters, of decisions hanging heavy in the balance. She considered the invitation again, the meticulously chosen words, the elegant but subtly flawed seal. It reminded her of the Miller's Lane scandal a few years back, where a perfectly innocent-looking garden party invitation had been the precursor to a bitter argument over land boundaries, escalating into accusations and a fractured friendship that never healed. The initial pleasantries had masked a seething undercurrent of tension. "One hopes it's simply a joyous occasion, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured, though her inner conviction suggested otherwise. The delicate, almost brittle nature of the parchment, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of lilies, out of season and slightly cloying, clung to the paper. Lilies were a funereal flower, not typically associated with birthdays. Why would such a detail be overlooked, or worse, deliberately chosen? It was a tiny thread, barely visible, but Miss Marple's fingers had a knack for finding the loose ends in life's intricate tapestry. This Christmas Eve party, she sensed, would be anything but straightforward. A chill, deeper than the coming snow, had settled in her heart. Something was amiss at Blackwood Manor, and the invitation was merely the herald of its subtle, unsettling presence. Chapter 2: Arrival and Apprehension. Christmas Eve dawned, a pearl-grey sky above a land blanketed in fresh, untrodden snow. The air was still and crisp, carrying the distant chime of church bells. Miss Marple, bundled in her warmest coat and sensible boots, arranged for a local boy to drive her in his pony trap to Blackwood Manor. The journey, usually a pleasant amble, felt charged with a curious solemnity. As they approached the gates, carved stone gargoyles watched over the snow-laden drive, seeming to cast long, silent shadows. Blackwood Manor itself was a formidable sight. Its Victorian Gothic architecture, usually rather severe, was softened by festive garlands of holly and ivy, and discreetly placed lanterns casting a warm, inviting glow. Yet, for all the outward cheer, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of disquiet. It was like a finely painted portrait with a single, almost imperceptible crack in the varnish. The grandeur felt a little forced, the warmth a little too eager. Inside, the great hall buzzed with the muted chatter of arriving guests. A magnificent Christmas tree, towering to the vaulted ceiling, glittered with candles and glass baubles. Miss Marple, however, found her eyes drawn not to the splendor, but to a small detail. A sprig of mistletoe above a side archway was slightly askew, and beneath it, on the pale damask wallpaper, a faint, discolored stain, poorly concealed by a more recent patch, hinted at a past imperfection or damage. Mr. Alastair Finch, the septuagenarian host, greeted his guests with an effusive, almost frantic joviality. He was a man with sharp features and a shock of white hair. His eyes, however, seemed to betray a deeper strain. He clapped shoulders, offered boisterous welcomes, yet Miss Marple noticed his gaze darting restlessly around the room, as if searching for someone, or perhaps, dreading someone's arrival. His niece, Eleanor Finch, was a vision in emerald green silk, her dark hair impeccably coiled. She moved with an elegant confidence, charming everyone, yet Miss Marple observed a flicker of calculation in her eyes as she spoke to a prosperous-looking local industrialist. Nearby, Richard Thorne, Alastair's nephew, slouched by the fireplace, nursing a brandy. He offered only curt greetings, his face a mask of brooding resentment, occasionally casting furtive glances towards Eleanor. Miss Marple distinctly caught a brief, tense exchange between them, a hushed word from Eleanor, a dismissive wave from Richard, quickly masked by a forced smile from Eleanor as another guest approached. Mrs. Gable, the manor's formidable housekeeper, oversaw the proceedings with the hawk-eyed vigilance of a sentry. She was a stern, grey-haired woman who seemed to embody the very essence of Blackwood Manor's long history, her loyalty to Mr. Finch unwavering, yet Miss Marple detected a certain possessiveness in her manner, as if the house and its secrets were her own. Dr. Armitage, the village physician, a kindly man with a reassuring bedside manner, joined Miss Marple briefly, murmuring, "Alastair seems rather overstimulated, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" "Not entirely himself. All this excitement can't be good for his heart, you know." Just then, a commotion at the entrance heralded the late arrival of a Mrs. Clarice Albright. She was an elegant woman, perhaps in her late 40s, with striking auburn hair and piercing blue eyes. Alastair Finch's forced smile wavered, and a subtle pallor spread across his face as he greeted her, almost formally. Clarice Albright, Miss Marple recalled, was Alastair's estranged cousin, a distant relation who had been caught up in the Oldwell dispute, disappearing from the local scene for years. Her sudden reappearance now, after decades, was highly curious. As Clarice exchanged cool, polite greetings with Eleanor and Richard, a peculiar silence fell upon the hall, momentarily muffling the festive chatter. The grandfather clock in the corner, a grand old sentinel of time, struck the half-hour with a deep, resonant chime that seemed to echo the unspoken tension in the room. In that precise moment, as heads turned towards the clock, Miss Marple's peripheral vision caught Alastair Finch, his face ashen, quickly tucking a small, ornately carved wooden box into his inner coat pocket. He quickly patted his chest, a fleeting gesture, before resuming his over-the-top joviality. No one else seemed to notice this small, telling act. The box, Miss Marple mused, held something of immense significance, something Alastair wished to keep profoundly secret, even amidst the forced celebration of his own birthday. Chapter 3: The Gift and the Shadow. The drawing-room at Blackwood Manor was a symphony of festive opulence, rich velvet and polished mahogany gleaming under the soft light of gas lamps. Guests, now mellowed by mulled wine and conversation, gathered as Alastair Finch prepared for the presentation of his birthday gifts. He sat in a high-backed armchair by the roaring fireplace, a forced smile plastered on his face, though Miss Marple noted a perpetual fidgeting of his left hand, occasionally touching his chest where she had seen him stash the small wooden box. Gifts, wrapped in shimmering paper and tied with satin ribbons, were brought forth. Many were predictable: expensive cigars, rare liqueurs, books of poetry. Richard Thorne presented his gift first, a leather-bound first edition of a rather obscure botanical text. "For your continued scholarly pursuits, Uncle," he announced, the words laced with an almost imperceptible sarcasm. Alastair received it with a nod, but his eye seemed to assess Richard rather than the gift. Eleanor, not to be outdone, presented an exquisite gold pocket watch, inscribed with a rather saccharine message. "To mark 70 years of your distinguished life, dear uncle." Alastair's reaction was peculiar. He examined the watch with a furrowed brow, a flicker of suspicion in his gaze, before offering a strained thank you. He made no move to place it in his pocket, merely setting it aside on a small table. Miss Marple noted that the ornately carved wooden box was no longer visible, nor was Alastair touching his chest. Just as the next gift was being unwrapped, a sudden, sharp crack, like a breaking branch, echoed from outside, followed by a momentary flicker of the gas lamps. The room plunged into a brief, disorienting semi-darkness before the lights flared back to full brilliance. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. In that fleeting moment of partial obscurity, Miss Marple, ever watchful, caught a swift movement near the mantelpiece, a dark shape darting low to the ground, too quick and too purposeful to be a shadow. It was gone as soon as the lights returned. Alastair Finch, visibly shaken, gripped the arms of his chair. "Just the wind, I suppose," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Yet, his gaze was fixed, not on the window, but on the mantelpiece, a nervous tension in his posture. Old Mr. Enderby, the village's unofficial chronicler of gossip, leaned towards his wife, his voice a stage whisper easily caught by Miss Marple. "Heard Alastair's been making some rather drastic changes to his will, you know. Been seeing Mr. Hemlock, the solicitor, quite often. They say he's added some unexpected beneficiary. Might explain why young Eleanor and Richard look like they've swallowed a lemon." Miss Marple subtly shifted her attention back to the mantelpiece. On its polished oak surface, near where the fleeting figure had been, she noticed a tiny, dark smudge. It wasn't soot from the fire, nor was it a simple dust mark. It was a fresh scratch, perhaps an inch long, thin and sharp, as if something hard and metallic had been dragged across the wood with considerable force. It was barely visible against the dark grain, but to Miss Marple's keen eye, it stood out with an unsettling clarity. Alastair, excusing himself with a strained smile, rose from his chair. I believe I need a moment of quiet reflection, if you'll excuse me. The excitement, you understand." His eyes, however, were not on the guests, but flickered nervously to the scratch on the mantelpiece, then back to the room, as if weighing a sudden, unpleasant realization. As he walked out, his steps seemed heavier, his joviality completely gone, leaving behind only an air of palpable unease. The Christmas Eve celebration had taken an abrupt, chilling turn. Chapter 4: The Disappearance. Alastair Finch's departure left a noticeable void in the drawing-room. The festive chatter, once so vibrant, dwindled to polite murmurs and confused glances. Eleanor, recovering her composure quickly, announced with practiced charm, "My uncle is merely a little overwhelmed, I imagine. 70 is a significant milestone." But her eyes, Miss Marple observed, held a calculating gleam, scanning the faces of the guests as if searching for something, or someone. Minutes stretched into an uncomfortable quarter of an hour. The servants, moving quietly amongst the guests with trays of refreshments, began to exchange worried glances. Mrs. Gable, usually a picture of stoic efficiency, was visibly flustered, her usually rigid posture softened by a nervous tremor. She approached Eleanor. "Mr. Finch has not returned, Miss Eleanor. Should I send someone to look for him?" Eleanor frowned. "He merely desired a moment of peace, Mrs. Gable. I'm sure he'll be back directly." But even as she spoke, a ripple of genuine concern began to spread. Richard, who had been silently observing from the corner, suddenly straightened. Perhaps he went to his study. He often retreats there when he has a mind to brood. A junior footman, a young lad named Thomas, piped up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Mr. Finch, sir. He went towards his study, yes, but then I thought I heard a noise, sir. Not a loud one. Like a soft thud, or a muffled cry, from the direction of the old antechamber, by the library." He quickly added, "But it was probably just the wind, sir. The manor does make noises on a night like this." He looked nervously at Mrs. Gable, who shot him a withering look. Miss Marple, however, paid particular attention to the boy's words. A muffled cry. Not the wind. She discreetly excused herself and made her way towards the library. The long corridor was dim, lit only by a few wall sconces, their gas flames flickering. As she approached the study, she saw, as Thomas had described, the door slightly ajar. But the interior was dark, no light spilling out. And yet, an unmistakable scent lingered in the air around the doorway, the rich, earthy aroma of pipe tobacco. Alastair Finch, Miss Marple knew, was strictly a non-smoker. As she moved further down the corridor, towards the old antechamber Thomas had mentioned, the air grew colder, and the silence more profound. A search party was already beginning to form in the main hall, voices rising in anxious murmurs. Mrs. Gable, passing Miss Marple on her way back to the drawing-room, wrung her hands. "He was so agitated earlier today, Miss Marple. Distracted. As if he was expecting something terrible to happen, poor man." Her eyes were wide with what appeared to be genuine distress, though Miss Marple noted how quickly she averted her gaze when their eyes met. The antechamber door was closed. Miss Marple tried the handle. It was locked. A faint, almost inaudible scratching sound emanated from within, as if something light was being dragged across a rough surface. This was not the wind. A new wave of alarm washed over her. Just as she was about to call for help, her eyes fell upon a tiny object nestled on the dusty floorboards of the seldom-used service staircase landing, directly opposite the antechamber door. It was a single, small, highly polished ebony bead. It lay stark against the pale wood, utterly out of place amongst the ancient dust. Miss Marple bent down, her fingers, still nimble despite her age, picking it up. It felt smooth, cool, and oddly familiar. She remembered the small, ornate wooden box Alastair had so carefully tucked into his pocket earlier, its surface carved with intricate patterns. She had only glimpsed it, but now, holding the bead, a faint, unsettling memory stirred. This bead, she was almost certain, was part of the decoration on that very box. Alastair Finch had not merely disappeared, he had been taken, and the ebony bead was a silent, ominous clue left in the wake of his vanishing. Chapter 5: The Discovery and the Suspects. The discovery of the locked antechamber door, coupled with Miss Marple's quiet insistence, quickly galvanized the search party. Richard Thorne, with surprising force, kicked the door, then turned to a footman. "Fetch a crowbar. Quickly!" There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, the polite concern replaced by a grim, undeniable urgency. The old antechamber, a rarely used space meant for quiet contemplation or storing forgotten treasures, yielded its secret with a splintering crash. Inside, the scene was one of disarray. A small, upholstered chair lay overturned, a reading lamp askew, and a scattering of old books littered the floor. And there, slumped against a heavy oak chest, was Alastair Finch. He was unconscious, his face pale, a thin trickle of saliva at the corner of his mouth. Dr. Armitage, who had quickly joined the group, knelt by Alastair, his brow furrowed in concern. He checked his pulse, lifted an eyelid. "He's alive, thank heavens. But deeply unconscious. Appears to be a powerful sedative." He glanced around the room. No obvious signs of injury, though. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the room's subtle details. Alastair's hand, lying open on the floor, was clutched around a single, dried holly leaf. It seemed an innocuous detail amidst the chaos, but Miss Marple noted its odd, almost deliberate placement. The window, high and narrow, was slightly ajar, letting in a draught of icy air despite the cold night. And a faint but distinct smell, not of Christmas marzipan, but something sharper, almost bittersweet, like almonds, lingered in the air, quickly dismissed by others as the scent of a forgotten Christmas treat. She also noticed a fresh, deep scratch on the antechamber doorframe, not from the lock, but as if something heavy had been forced through the gap, either in or out. Constable Davies, the local officer, arrived a little later, his face flushed from the cold and the unexpected summons. He was a well-meaning man, but often seemed to miss the forest for the trees. He surveyed the scene, taking hurried notes. "Right, then. Mr. Finch found unconscious. And the valuable item he was carrying, this ornate wooden box you mentioned, Miss Marple, is gone." Eleanor Finch stepped forward, her face a mask of distraught concern, but her eyes, Miss Marple noticed, flickered to Richard, then back to the room. "Oh, Uncle! Who would do such a thing? What could he possibly have of such value?" Her distress seemed almost theatrical. Richard, on the other hand, was unnervingly calm, his face pale but stoic, though his gaze, too, kept returning to a specific spot on the floor near the overturned chair. Mrs. Gable, now weeping openly, clutched a lace handkerchief, but Miss Marple observed that even in her distress, her eyes darted to the slightly ajar window, then to the heavy oak chest, almost as if checking something. Dr. Armitage gently helped move Alastair. It was a fast-acting sedative, Constable. Quite potent. Whoever administered it knew what they were doing. And they wanted him out of the way for a while, not permanently. He paused. "This isn't a simple case of a robbery, I think. This points to something more calculated." Miss Marple quietly bent down, retrieved the holly leaf from the floor, and unobtrusively slipped it into her pocket. As she did so, she noticed a tiny, almost invisible, dark red speck on its underside. It wasn't blood, too small and too vibrant. It looked like a fragment of something, barely discernible against the dull green of the leaf. A silent, potent piece of the puzzle, waiting to be placed. The Christmas Eve celebration had indeed become a mystery, and the first act had ended with a chilling, unsettling question: who wanted Alastair Finch silenced, and why was a decorative wooden box more valuable than the well-being of its owner? Chapter 6: Whispers and Past Grievances. The next morning, Christmas Day at Blackwood Manor felt less like a celebration and more like a somber vigil. A thick blanket of snow had fallen overnight, sealing the estate in a pristine, but isolating, silence. Alastair Finch, though recovering, was still groggy and disoriented, able to offer only fragmented, confused memories of the previous night. Constable Davies, well-meaning but out of his depth in the labyrinthine world of family secrets, conducted his interviews, getting evasive answers and polite deflections. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved through the house with her usual quiet observation, listening to the various snippets of conversation, the whispers that seemed to cling to the frosty air. The village network, ever efficient, had already begun to hum with speculation. Dr. Armitage, stopping by for a follow-up, confided in Miss Marple, "Alastair is fortunate, really. A man of his constitution, with a known heart condition, a shock like this, or too strong a sedative, could have been fatal. Someone took a terrible risk with his life, just for a box." His gaze was troubled, hinting at a deeper understanding of the family's delicate dynamics. Mrs. Gable, still distraught, approached Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I remembered something. Mr. Finch, he was so troubled yesterday morning. He told me he was expecting an unwelcome visitor. He said, 'Mrs. Gable, be prepared for a difficult encounter.' But he wouldn't say who." Her eyes, however, still held that peculiar darting quality, briefly settling on a heavy antique side table in the hall before she looked away. Later, Miss Marple overheard a hushed conversation between Eleanor and Richard. Eleanor, her voice low and sharp, accused Richard, "You always did resent Uncle Alastair, Richard, with your gambling debts and your constant need for money. Did you think this would somehow change his will in your favor?" Richard's face tightened. "And you, Eleanor? Always clinging to him, feigning devotion, when all you care about is your own inheritance. Don't you dare try to pin this on me." Their old feuds were clearly bubbling to the surface, fueled by suspicion and fear. Richard then subtly tried to change the subject, mentioning his recent investment opportunities that had, in fact, led to significant losses. The most intriguing piece of gossip, however, came from Cook, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatics. While preparing a restorative broth for Mr. Finch, she leaned into Miss Marple. "Weeks ago, Miss Marple, just before the first snow, I overheard a terrible row in Mr. Finch's study. A woman, a stranger, I'd never seen her before. She had fiery red hair and eyes like burning embers. And she was shouting, 'You cannot deny her what is rightfully hers, Alastair. Not after all these years.' Mr. Finch, he was very distressed after she left. Never saw her again, though." Cook made a cross sign over her chest. "Sent a shiver right through me, it did." Miss Marple quietly pieced these fragments together. An unwelcome visitor expected by Alastair. A strange woman with fiery eyes demanding justice. The recent changes to Alastair's will, mentioned by Mr. Enderby and Mr. Hemlock. All pointed to a deep-seated secret, a past grievance that was now resurfacing, demanding attention. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made another quiet circuit of the antechamber. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, a place she felt someone might stash something in a hurry, she found a discarded, half-smoked cigarette butt. It was a peculiar, foreign brand, unlike any Alastair Finch or his known guests would smoke. And as she brought it closer, she detected a faint, but distinct, floral scent clinging to the tobacco. Not the pipe tobacco from the hallway, but something delicate, almost exotic. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but for Miss Marple, it clicked with Cook's description of that strange woman. The Christmas mystery was deepening, and the clues suggested a complex web woven between the past and the present, involving someone entirely unexpected. Chapter 7: The Hidden Compartment and the Cryptic Clue. With Alastair Finch slowly but surely regaining his faculties, albeit still muddled by the sedative, Miss Marple sought permission to examine his study. It was a room of quiet erudition, lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak furniture. Yet, even here, an air of unspoken tension lingered. Alastair, when Miss Marple briefly visited him, had become agitated when she gently asked about the missing wooden box. It was a legacy, he'd whispered, his voice weak. Something vital. For her. He seemed unable to complete the thought, drifting off into a fitful sleep. As Miss Marple systematically surveyed the study, her eyes, accustomed to spotting anomalies, moved from the overflowing bookshelves to the grand desk. She noticed a faint discoloration on the wood paneling behind the desk, almost imperceptible, as if a small section had been repeatedly handled or moved. Her delicate fingers explored the area, finding a cleverly concealed catch. With a gentle push, a small, shallow compartment sprang open, revealing not the missing wooden box, but a single, old, faded photograph. It showed a young Alastair Finch, perhaps in his 20s, his face less careworn, beaming beside a beautiful woman with a cascade of fiery red hair and a child, a girl of about 5 or 6, nestled between them. The woman had the same piercing eyes Cook had described, like burning embers. Alastair Finch had never married, nor acknowledged any children. This photograph was a profound revelation. On the back, in elegant, faded ink, were the words, Lillian, Alastair and Clara, June 1905. The initials CF and a date. Clara Finch. His daughter. The existence of whom was clearly a deeply guarded secret. The unwelcome visitor and strange woman Cook mentioned now took on a startling new meaning. Just then, Mr. Hemlock, Alastair's solicitor, arrived, looking rather harried. He nodded to Miss Marple, then spoke to Eleanor and Richard, who had followed Miss Marple into the study. Mr. Finch had requested my presence to finalize some amendments to his will immediately after his birthday celebration. He mentioned a beneficiary from his past, someone he wished to acknowledge at long last. He glanced nervously towards the photograph Miss Marple held. He was quite adamant it had to be done on Christmas Eve. Eleanor's face, usually composed, flushed with anger. A beneficiary from his past? But Uncle Alastair has no other family save for Richard and myself. Richard merely grunted, but his eyes were wide with a dawning, terrible realization. The missing box, the legacy, clearly held the proof of this secret daughter, Clara, and Alastair's intention to include her in his will, undoubtedly at the expense of his niece and nephew. Miss Marple carefully placed the photograph back in the compartment. Her mind, however, was still dwelling on the tiny, dark red speck on the holly leaf she had pocketed. She pulled it out again and, under the stronger light of the study lamp, examined it more closely. It wasn't just a stain. It was a tiny, almost microscopic shard of what looked like red enamel or glass, delicately embedded in the leaf. It was too small to be from a brooch or a piece of jewelry, and it glittered with an artificial sheen. What could it be from? As her eye scanned the room, a new thought struck her, connecting this tiny fragment to a more specific, personal detail, one she had observed earlier. The puzzle was taking on a new, more sinister shape, revealing a motive that cut to the very heart of the Finch family's intricate legacy. The truth, like the photograph, was beginning to emerge from its hiding place. Chapter 8: The Second Incident and the Pattern. The day after Christmas brought with it not just continued snow, but a further unsettling incident at Blackwood Manor. The stable boy, young Thomas, burst into the hall, his face pale with shock. Someone's tampered with the carriage, Mrs. Gable. The reins were nearly cut through. If I hadn't noticed, Mr. Finch's carriage could have had a terrible accident on the icy drive. He gestured frantically towards the rarely used side entrance, near the old stables. I saw a light, too, last night, near the stables, after Mr. Finch disappeared. Like an old lantern. Mrs. Gable, her composure now completely shattered, shrieked, "Good heavens! Another outrage!" She looked utterly distraught, but Miss Marple noticed her quick glance towards a heavy-duty, antique lantern resting on a nearby side table, a lantern with distinct, decorative enamel buttons. Mrs. Gable quickly explained, "I was merely checking the lantern for emergency use, Thomas. There was no one else about." But Thomas, shaking his head, insisted, "No, I saw it in use. Someone was carrying it." Later that morning, another minor, yet equally perplexing incident occurred. Eleanor Finch, her voice shrill with indignation, reported a theft from her room. "My silver locket! It's gone! The one with the miniature portrait of my great-aunt Amelia." She made a great show of her distress, drawing everyone's attention. Constable Davies diligently took notes, but the locket seemed a trivial matter compared to the attack on Alastair Finch. Miss Marple, however, found no incident inconsequential. She quietly walked the snowy paths around the manor, her eye scanning for any anomaly. Not far from the main path, partially concealed beneath a snow-laden rhododendron bush, she found Eleanor's stolen locket. It had been hastily discarded, but its most important feature was missing. The tiny miniature portrait that was supposed to be inside was gone. Someone had not wanted the locket itself, but its contents. The locket was merely a diversion. The stable incident, too, resonated with Miss Marple. The side entrance, near the old stables, was a secluded part of the house, not far from the antechamber where Alastair had been found. It would have been an ideal, clandestine escape route for someone fleeing the manor. And the mention of an old lantern, it brought to mind Mrs. Gable's seemingly innocent explanation, yet contradicted Thomas's eyewitness account. The scent of floral perfume on the cigarette butt, and Cook's description of that strange woman with fiery red hair, now connected with the photograph of Lillian from Alastair's study. Lillian, the mother of his secret daughter, Clara. Back in her room, Miss Marple retrieved the holly leaf and the tiny red enamel shard. She considered the distinctive, decorative button she had noticed on Mrs. Gable's antique lantern, and then, a stronger memory surfaced. Mrs. Gable wore a very particular, old-fashioned Christmas brooch, always pinned to her dress during the festive season. A brooch with small, intricate, red enamel details. She recalled seeing it during the gift-giving ceremony. A sense of dawning certainty washed over her. She rose and went downstairs, seeking out Mrs. Gable under the pretext of inquiring about a lost glove. Mrs. Gable, flustered, was polishing some silverware. On her apron, pinned firmly, was the Christmas brooch. It was a beautiful piece, an intricate silverwork with tiny, detailed red enamel berries. Miss Marple casually leaned closer, admiring the brooch. The tiny, almost microscopic shard of red enamel embedded in the holly leaf was an exact match for the tiny berries on Mrs. Gable's brooch. One of them was indeed missing. The pattern was emerging, clear and chilling, pointing to a motive far more personal and desperate than simple greed, one entwined with the deep-seated secrets of Blackwood Manor. That stolen locket, the missing portrait, the cigarette butt, the holly leaf, and the attack on Alastair Finch were not isolated incidents but carefully orchestrated moves in a desperate game. Chapter 9, The Unmasking, Pre-Climax. The atmosphere in Blackwood Manor on the following morning was thick with unspoken tension, heavier than the falling snow. Alastair Finch, though recovering, looked pale and haunted. Constable Davies, still struggling, had decided to gather the key figures in the drawing-room for a final round of questioning. Eleanor, Richard, Mrs. Gable, Dr. Armitage, and Mr. Hemlock were all present. Miss Marple, too, was invited, her presence now recognized as invaluable. Miss Marple began to speak, her voice soft but clear, weaving together the disparate threads of the mystery. The events of Christmas Eve were, I believe, not merely a robbery, but an attempt to prevent Mr. Finch from revealing a significant truth. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. A truth connected to a legacy, a secret from his past. She recounted that unwelcome visitor Mrs. Gable remembered, and that strange woman with fiery eyes Cook had seen, linking them to the photograph of Lillian and young Clara Finch found in Alastair's study. Mr. Finch intended to acknowledge his daughter, Clara, in his will. The missing ornate wooden box, the legacy, I believe contained the proof of this, perhaps a letter from Lillian, or a copy of the new will. Eleanor interjected, her voice sharp, "But who is this Clara? And why would it cause such an attack?" Because, Miss Marple replied gently, it would undoubtedly alter the inheritance expectations of others. And because, I believe, the person who attacked Mr. Finch already knew about Clara, and had a very personal stake in keeping her existence a secret, or at least from being acknowledged publicly in the will. She then turned her attention to Eleanor. Miss Eleanor, you reported your silver locket stolen. You claimed it contained a miniature of your great-aunt Amelia. Yet, when it was found, the miniature was gone. Why? Eleanor stammered, I don't know. Perhaps the thief removed it. Or perhaps, Miss Marple continued, her eyes fixed on Eleanor, the thief knew what was inside. You see, the miniature portrait in your locket was not of your great-aunt Amelia. It was of Lillian, the mother of Alistair's daughter, Clara. You knew of this secret, didn't you, Miss Eleanor? Eleanor's face went white. She had possessed the miniature, a family secret perhaps passed down, a subtle piece of blackmail or leverage against her uncle. Richard, beside her, looked utterly aghast. Miss Marple then shifted her gaze to Mrs. Gable, who had become visibly agitated, her hands clenching and unclenching. And the ebony bead from the missing box, Mrs. Gable. I found it near the old service staircase. The carriage tampering near the stables, and the old lantern young Thomas saw in use, all these things point to a concerted effort to create confusion and to cover tracks. Mrs. Gable spluttered, I swear, Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with any of it. The lantern was for emergencies. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. And the tiny, red enamel shard found embedded in the holly leaf, clutched in Mr. Finch's hand when he was discovered. It is an exact match for the missing berry from your antique Christmas brooch, Mrs. Gable. She pointed to the brooch still pinned to Mrs. Gable's dress, a small, dark gap visible where a red enamel berry should have been. Mrs. Gable's carefully constructed composure shattered. Her eyes widened in terror, her face losing all color. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a sound of profound shock and dawning dread. The room fell silent, the weight of Miss Marple's gentle, yet utterly precise, accusation pressing down on everyone. The true perpetrator, the hidden motive, and the pieces of the Christmas Eve enigma had at last clicked into place, leaving only the full, heart-breaking revelation to come. Chapter 10, The Revelation and Resolution. The silence in the drawing-room was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Mrs. Gable stood frozen, her face contorted in a mask of despair and disbelief, her hand instinctively going to her brooch, feeling the small, empty space where the red enamel berry had been. Miss Marple's gaze, though gentle, held an unwavering certainty. Mrs. Gable, Miss Marple began, her voice soft but resonating with authority, you have served the Finch family for many years, loyal and devoted. You have always been the quiet strength of Blackwood Manor. You knew all its secrets, its histories, its promises. And among those promises, I believe, was one made to you. She paused, allowing Mrs. Gable's visible agony to sink in. You were, by a previous will, or perhaps by Mr. Finch's own word, assured a significant inheritance, a comfortable future, or perhaps even the manor itself, upon his passing. You believed, quite reasonably, that your decades of unwavering service would be justly rewarded. Mrs. Gable's chin trembled, and tears began to stream down her weathered cheeks. Then, Miss Marple continued, Mr. Finch found Lillian again. And with her, his daughter, Clara. He intended to acknowledge Clara, to make amends for a lifetime of secrecy, and to provide for her in his will. This change, this sudden shift in his intentions, threatened everything you had been promised, everything you had worked for, and perhaps, everything you felt you were owed for your silent devotion. Mrs. Gable let out a choked sob. He promised. He said the manor would be mine. My life, my dedication, all for him. And then, for some illegitimate child, he was going to cast me aside. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. You felt betrayed. The Christmas Eve party was his chosen moment to announce this change, to present the missing ornate music box, which contained the proofs of Clara's parentage and his new intentions. "You knew this, didn't you?" Mrs. Gable, defeated, could only nod, her shoulders shaking. During the brief power flicker, Miss Marple explained, turning to the others. Mrs. Gable seized her opportunity. She snatched the music box from Mr. Finch, then used the sedative, perhaps a strong sleeping draught she kept for her own ailments, or even one pilfered from Dr. Armitage's bag when he visited, to incapacitate him. The antechamber, being rarely used, was the perfect place to hide him, locking him in until the new will was signed, preventing his announcement. In the struggle, the ebony bead from the box came loose, and the red enamel berry from her brooch, so distinctive, became embedded in the holly leaf he clutched. The faint almond smell, Dr. Armitage murmured, understanding dawning in his eyes, was from the sedative. A common ingredient in certain remedies. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. The cigarette but with the floral scent was a clever diversion, perhaps left by Mrs. Gable to implicate a mysterious outsider like Lillian, whom Cook had seen weeks ago. The tampering with the carriage reins was a desperate attempt to further confuse matters, using the old lantern that young Thomas saw. And Eleanor's locket? Mrs. Gable, knowing Eleanor's secret possession of Lillian's miniature, took it, destroying the portrait to eliminate a tangible link between Alastair and Clara. She sought to wipe away any trace of the truth that threatened her future. Constable Davies, now seeing the intricate pattern, turned to Mrs. Gable with a grave face. "Mrs. Gable, I'm afraid